We are diving deep today into one of the most frustrating barriers in language acquisition, that vast, subtle gap that exists between high-level proficiency, the person who can pass a C1 or C2 exam, who is grammatically almost flawless, and true intuitive fluency. The source material captures the struggle perfectly, suggesting that many advanced learners possess the machinery of the language without its soul.
It's the final elusive frontier. I mean, we all know these students. They are intellectually formidable, they write beautifully, but the moment the conversation shifts to humor or emotion or rapid social maneuvering, there is this distinct, almost intangible plateau they just can't seem to climb over.
Exactly. They know the rules, but they don't own the language. And this leads us to the central question we have to tackle from the material. What is the single most essential ingredient that pushes a learner across this divide? Is it primarily a profound cognitive shift, the deep intuitive rewiring of how the brain processes language mechanics? Or is it fundamentally a pragmatic demonstration, so the mastery of complex cultural, emotional, and social functions in the real world? I will be arguing that the essential hallmark of true fluency is that internal, intuitive, unconscious cognitive shift. That internal foundation has to be set before the external edifice can stand.
Interesting. I'd look at that a bit differently. While that internal process is, of course, necessary groundwork, I maintain that true fluency is fundamentally defined by its observable, external utility. The signature of mastery is demonstrated through pragmatic application, specifically, the undeniable ability to play with language. Fluency is functional. It's about managing people, leading conversations, and creating genuine emotional connection.
So let's start with the internal then, because this is where the speed bump lives. My position is that true fluency is fundamentally about the internal process. That moment when the scaffolding of conscious learning falls away. The very advanced student is still burdened, even if it's only for a few milliseconds, by what we call cognitive translation and conscious processing. They are thinking about the grammar. They are running a subtle internal check, and that creates a tiny, perceptible lag in their speech that removes all true spontaneity. We see the evidence for this in the operation of intuitive grammar. A fluent speaker doesn't stop to recall the rule for the third conditional. They simply feel which structure is right. If a beginner says, "I have lived here since 3 years," the fluent speaker doesn't correct the specific tense application. They simply know viscerally that it sounds fundamentally wrong. The most common diagnostic test is knowing instinctively that phrases like "a little of milk" are syntactically and rhythmically incorrect, even if the grammatical error is hard to articulate quickly. This automatic, subconscious rejection of incorrect structure is the bedrock. Until the language is processed automatically, the user is still a translator, not a speaker.
Right. I understand the allure of an automatic, frictionless brain state. We all want that. But I just don't buy that the internal processing speed is the defining metric. It's a key enabler, yes, but fluency is functionally defined by its real-world utility. What is the value of a fast brain if that speed is used only to produce stiff, formally correct sentences? The source material is clear. The fluent speaker uses the language not just to inform, but to manage, persuade, and lead. This takes us into the soul of the language, the cultural, emotional, and rhetorical layers. The ultimate metric of true fluency is the ability to play with language. The source material is clear. This is the observable external behavior we look for. Can they effortlessly code switch between formal and casual register?
Can they use sarcasm, deploy subtle humor, or convey that highly nuanced emotion, say the specific blend of affectionate annoyance that defines a long-term friendship, with precision? Consider Anja, who is described in the material. She wasn't just presenting data in the budget meeting, she broke a mounting tension by deploying the perfect, slightly vulgar, yet deeply appropriate idiom. We need to stop circling the drain and make a decision. That idiom was deployed not just correctly, but pragmatically, to manage the room. Or think of Diego. His fluency was proven not when he explained a technical concept flawlessly, but when he wrote a hilarious parody soliloquy about the frustrations of his favorite text editor. That act of creation, of finding humor and shared frustration, demonstrates complete ownership of the language and culture. Fluency is proven by the ability to connect and create, which goes far beyond mere cognitive correctness.
I see the power in the Anja and Diego examples. They are certainly the goal, but I think those sophisticated pragmatic actions are only possible once the internal struggle is resolved. What stops the very advanced student from achieving that level of pragmatic play? It often stems from I guess you could call it the psychological block of the perfectionism trap. The VAS is hyper-aware of mistakes because they've learned the rules so meticulously. They are constantly monitoring their own output, essentially watching their form instead of focusing on hitting the ball to the other player. That internal friction, that constant self-correction, is the spontaneity killer. If you have to pause internally to ensure the grammar of a pun is correct, the joke is already dead, the tension-breaking moment is missed, and the entire pragmatic window closes. This is why the benchmark is often thinking and dreaming in English, because that is the sign that the language is finally operating below the level of conscious self-monitoring.
That's a compelling argument, but I wonder if that anxiety you describe, the perfectionism trap, is merely a symptom of a deeper external problem. The material they were taught was too sanitized. The anxiety is less about speed and more about relevance. The language used by the VAS is often too formal and standardized precisely because they live in the textbook bubble. They speak flawless yet sterile English. Their struggle isn't just about the milliseconds of processing speed, it's about lacking the necessary cultural, generational, and idiomatic vocabulary to engage in the spontaneous, pragmatic use required in real life. They may understand the literal definition of the idiom, to beat around the bush, cognitively, but they haven't internalized or felt the specific shade of frustration, impatience, or casual annoyance it implies. This isn't a grammatical or speed failure, it's a failure of cultural and idiomatic depth. You need to know that difference, the difference between using sick, fire, or based in the right context to genuinely play the language game. That knowledge has to be acquired through active, strategic, cultural engagement, not just by waiting for the brain's circuits to fire faster.
But if the brain were truly operating on autopilot, wouldn't those cultural nuances be absorbed and applied faster? You're describing a vocabulary deficiency, and I agree that cultural knowledge is vital. But I think the reason the VAS fails to acquire and deploy that vocabulary spontaneously is because their mental resources are still tied up in the foundational mechanics. They have no bandwidth left for the cultural signaling. The cognitive effort required to simply construct a clause prevents them from accessing the necessary rhetorical flourish.
Well, this brings us directly to the critical barrier identified in the source, the difference between literal and rhetorical comprehension. And I want to emphasize that the failures we diagnose in VAS are inherently cultural and pragmatic. Let's look closely at those diagnostic cases. Marco, the highly competent financial analyst, was brilliant at his job, but failed miserably in social integration. Why? Because he missed cultural touchstones, casual references to 90s sitcoms or historical sports moments that served as conversational shorthand. He literally understood the words being spoken, but the shared emotional and cultural history, it was just absent, leaving him isolated. His internal mechanics were fine, his external cultural antenna was dead. And consider Yuki, the academic. She failed in intellectual sparring because she took a colleague's sarcastic challenge at face value. She missed the rhetorical subtext, the playful aggression and implicit respect, believing she was being literally attacked, which derailed the entire debate. These are not slow processing failures. These are failures of interpreting social and cultural signals. Fluency is defined by successfully navigating these highly nuanced interactions.
I see why you characterize these as purely external failures, but let me give you a different perspective on Marco and Yuki. Those failures are the observable symptoms of the underlying lack of intuitive ownership. Why did Yuki miss the sarcastic subtext? Because she was still mentally encoding and decoding the literal meaning. The cognitive pathway required to process the words was so deliberate that the secondary necessary layer, the tone, the irony, the context, didn't register in time. If she were truly processing spontaneously, the sarcastic tone would land automatically alongside the literal meaning as part of what we call the idiomatic and cultural autopilot. The fact that Marco and Yuki had to think about the meaning of a cultural reference instead of reacting to it instantly proves the cognitive shift is incomplete. They possess the language machinery, but they lack the intuitive integration that allows for effortless cultural referencing, humor, and most critically, immediate comprehension of intent. The root problem is the nature of the internal processing. It is still conscious and therefore too slow for social combat.
But what if the cultural autopilot doesn't switch on automatically simply because the engine is fast? What if it needs to be built deliberately? I find it dangerous to assume that faster processing magically imbues a speaker with cultural literacy.
The faster processing is what provides the necessary space in the working memory. When you are no longer consciously generating correct sentences, your mental resources are freed up to focus entirely on the speaker's tone, body language, context, and implied meaning. Fluency isn't just about speed. It's about shifting the cognitive load off sentence generation and onto social comprehension.
I'm not convinced. The fact remains that Yuki's problem was her inability to read rhetorical subtext, and Marco's was a deficiency in shared narrative knowledge. These are learned external skills. They don't magically appear when your sentence speed improves. They must be trained. This leads us to the path forward. If the goal is that fundamental cognitive restructuring, then the source material suggests the necessity of passive immersion. The strategy emphasized is less about studying grammar drills and more about marinating in it, consuming culture, not just content. The advice given is strategic, like watching an entire TV series without subtitles, forcing the brain to adapt out of sheer necessity and fatigue. This passive, voluminous approach is designed to accelerate the internal, unconscious cognitive shift, forcing the brain to accept the language as a natural extension of itself, thus overriding the conscious censor. That's an interesting point, and I agree, immersion is vital for input. However, I think that framing misses the strategic effort required at this final stage. You cannot passively wait for your brain to switch the autopilot on. The source explicitly outlines active, strategic steps necessary to cross this final divide, proving that pragmatic skill must be actively developed and tested. Fluency isn't achieved just by waiting for the neural pathways to reorganize. It's by developing specialized external communicative tools. The text emphasizes creating an idiom and slang journal, not just to list definitions, but to record contextual chunks, how they are used in frustration, in joy, or in disbelief. It pushes for practicing nuance drills, exercises where the learner must express increasing levels of anger or uncertainty purely through modal verbs and adverbs, focusing on function over form. And critically, the advice stresses finding a third place like an online gaming community or a demanding hobby group where language use is spontaneous, high stakes, and requires immediate, complex, pragmatic output. These are highly intentional strategic efforts designed to rapidly build the specific pragmatic competence that the VAS lacks, moving the learner from merely knowing English to actively owning the ability to manage subtle, real-world communication.
This is the VAS to focus on usage instead of mechanics, tricking the brain out of the perfectionism trap. The nuance drills demand the speed and spontaneity that passive immersion aims for, but in a controlled environment. The outcome of these pragmatic drills is accelerated cognitive ownership. They are strategies to trigger the internal shift, not substitutes for it.
I just view it the other way around. The internal shift is validated only when the external tools are mastered. If you can perform the nuance drill, if you can flawlessly communicate that subtle blend of cautious optimism in a job negotiation, that mastery demonstrates that the cognitive hurdle has been overcome. The ability to use language as a strategic tool is the definition of fluency. The internal automaticity is just the means to that end.
Ultimately, what we are discussing is the transformation of the self through language. True fluency represents a profound cognitive restructuring. The advanced learner must embrace the intellectual humility that allows their internal monologue to switch, reducing the performance anxiety that stifles genuine spontaneity. The goal is internal comfort and automaticity for the language to become a true extension of your personality. It's an issue of psychological and cognitive integration.
And the most reliable functional metric of that internal transformation lies in its external application. The true test of fluency is the ability to utilize language to manage, persuade, and connect across emotional and cultural barriers. It requires the learner to move beyond using English correctly to actively owning it through strategic engagement with the nuances of humor, wit, and cultural context. The internal shift must always be verified by the external mastery of rhetorical and pragmatic functionality.
And so we return to this subtle yet profound distinction between competence and effortless ownership. It is the invisible boundary between knowing the machinery and possessing the soul.
Acknowledging that distinction and the dual demands it places, both deep cognitive integration and acute pragmatic skill, is essential for any advanced learner seeking to move beyond that persistent C1-C2 plateau. There is clearly much more to explore in the material regarding the specific psychology required to cross this final frustrating hurdle.